Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, Keeping Pace with Ongoing PFAS Developments. My name is Jack Sheldon. I'm the PFAS Service Line Lead and Senior Remediation Specialist at Antea Group, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Before we begin, let me go over a few housekeeping items. A copy of today's slide deck and additional materials are available in the resources list on your screen. If you have any questions during the broadcast, please submit them through the Q&A tool on your screen and we'll answer them at the end of our discussion. However, if we run out of time, we answer any unanswered questions via a follow-up email. This webcast is being streamed through your computer, so for the best audio quality, please make sure your computer or headset volume is turned up so you can hear the presenters. If you are experiencing any problems, most can be resolved with a quick screen refresh. An on-demand version of the webinar will be available about 2 hours after today's broadcast and can be accessed using the same link you received in your email when you registered. It will also be available in our webinar library on our website in the next few days. Now let's meet our presenters for today's session. Jason Legowski has over 30 years of experience in environmental consulting with expertise in the management and remediation of emerging contaminants, particularly PFAS. Naseem Pika has over 15 years of experience and she specializes in supporting projects involving environmental site assessment and characterization, forensic analysis, source tracking, and remediation of emerging contaminants, including PFAS. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm a senior remediation specialist and I lead the PFAS service line at Antea Group. I have over 40 years of experience in the fields of environmental microbiology and remediation and expertise in the area of emerging contaminants. So let's get started. Our agenda for today's short webinar is simple. We'll start off with PFAS risk. We'll then move on to the legal and regulatory highlights. And then lastly, we'll finish up with the ever interesting topic of PFAS forensics. So let me get started with risk. So as you evaluate your PFAS resilience or risk tolerance amidst all the regulatory changes that have been occurring in the marketplace, whether that be at the federal level, the state level, or even the global level, I suggest you look at risk in 3 different categories: brand, products, and people/worker exposure. Under brand, consider the messaging you might have for your clients or customers or other stakeholders. Also, keep tabs on legal updates as litigation thrives right now. Look at environmental justice issues as it relates to PFAS. And if you're no longer using PFAS, but have legacy issues, manage those issues and understand the risk from those issues. If you're involved in transactions, whether it be selling a property or buying a property, now is the time to consider PFAS in that equation. And then also look from an environmental standpoint. What are the discharge points from any processes that you might have or any releases that you've had historically within your operations? Shifting over to products, now's the time to look at your supply chain and have good, hearty conversations with your suppliers. They certainly are aware of the need to report on PFAS these days, and you will get response from those suppliers that you have good relationships with. So understanding what might be in your supplies from the standpoint of PFAS is important at this juncture. Also, any replacements that might be available out there. Also understand that product bans are coming. And that's really important to keep tabs on, whether that be at a state level or a country level. And then, of course, regulatory compliance is paramount. Many of you have TSCA and TRI reporting that certainly involve PFAS. Also keep tabs on toxicology updates and get training. There's lots of training available related to PFAS as it relates to different types of business operations. And then lastly, from the people side, understand processes that you may have in your operations. Are you protecting your workers properly? Even if you're not using raw materials containing PFAS, are you using other processing aids or other types of machinery, greases, or lubricants that potentially could contaminate your operations? Those are all things to consider. Look at your fire suppression scenario, particularly in a foam situation. Do you have a PFAS-free foam, or are you still using legacy foam or a newer generation of AFFF, which may still be PFAS containing? Those are important things when one considers their risks. And of course, again, regulatory compliance from the TSCA, TRI, and CERCLA standpoint is important under this risk category. So lots to think about and lots to do, but there are some simple actions you can take, and let's get into those. So action number 1 is to conduct a good desktop PFAS screening. And there are some excellent platforms available that allow you to do that, to really get into looking at updated safety data sheets, look at the chemistry of any PFAS hits that you might find in those safety data sheets, look at other risk scenarios within your operations, such as cleaning chemicals or pesticide use or containers that might contain PFAS, fire suppression operations, and any other thing that might result in a PFAS release from your operations. Identification is the most difficult step, but this is a critical step in your understanding of PFAS risk. Action, and one that I mentioned earlier, is collaborate with your supply chain vendors to eliminate non-essential PFAS in your supply chain. Again, vendors are quite savvy now, understanding the need to go away from PFAS. They may have alternatives ready for you. And there are more and more websites that are emerging that list replacement products and chemistries that you might consider for your operations. Third action step is do your own research and development and look for substitutions in your various product lines. Are you able to go fluorine-free? Do you know where to find those alternatives? Again, there are some excellent databases that have emerged. Suppliers can point you to alternatives. And in certain scenarios, it may be wise to conduct your own product testing and understand what might leach or come out of those products as far as PFAS. So this is another important step that you can consider. And one final action you can take is to keep up to date with, respond to, and anticipate regulations. You don't have to do this all on your own. There's some great resources out there that allow you to see what's coming. There's some dashboard tools that are available that will allow you to go in depth as far as regulations go. And when you have an opportunity to comment on a pending new regulation, do so if you have the time and the wherewithal to do that. So without getting into this any deeper, I'm going to pass things along to Naseem, who'll delve into it a bit more.
Thanks, Jack. So you probably have heard or seen the EPA strategic roadmap for PFAS. We know that EPA is committed to regulate PFAS in the environment through using different regulatory vehicles such as CERCLA or Safe Drinking Act. But this road hasn't been straight for EPA. There are several legal battles going around. There's several lawsuits against EPA right now, either for claiming that EPA's regulations are too stringent, or the lack of regulations. For example, some lawsuits claim that EPA has failed to take actions on regulating PFAS in biosolid fertilizers. So the PFAS regulatory landscape has been changing and evolving every day. So with the PFAS regulations changing often, there's a lot happening in this world. Here is some snapshots of the recent updates in the state. First is the Toxic Release Inventory or TRI Act. We saw an expansion recently that EPA has proposed adding over 100 new PFAS chemicals to the TRI list. This will increase transparency about how these PFASs are released in the environment and how they managed by the industries. This move would include 16 individual PFAS and 15 categories, and it mandates reporting even for a small amount of PFAS emissions, 100 pounds per year. As some of you already know about the TRI threshold, the 100 pounds per is for individual PFASs and is through manufacturing or processing or otherwise used. In the reporting year of 2023, we still had the de minimis concentration exemption, which was 0.1% for PFOA and 1% for the other listed PFASs, which basically means if the product has less than either of these concentrations, they do not need to be included in the TRI calculations. Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, is another recent update in the PFAS regulatory world, which you probably have heard about the deadline getting pushed back from May 2025 now to January 2026 for most companies. Small businesses that solely rely on importing PFAS will have an additional 6 months to submit their TSCA report. CERCLA, or Superfund designation, as of July, as of this past summer, both PFOA and PFAS are now officially hazardous substances. And this designation requires reporting of any releases of 1 pound or more in a 24-hour period. Basically is a mandatory process, and this act now enables EPA to enforce cleanups at contaminated sites. So PFAS regulatory updates across the globe include Europe's REACH restriction proposal, which was submitted in early 2023, and public consultations comments were held throughout the year. We expect the final decisions to be released in 2025, and with likely restrictions going into force in another year around 2026 and 2027. The proposal was to restrict or ban about 10,000 PFAS compounds, but it also includes exceptions or derogations for critical uses, such as medical devices, because as we know, there's not a good substitute for PFAS in those applications yet, and therefore they're extending the compliance deadline for up to 12 years in some cases. The persistent organic pollutants, the POPs regulations, has already put a ban or restricted specific PFAS such as PFOA and PFAS with strict limits, particularly for products such as firefighting foams. Canada, for the most part, has aligned itself with international efforts to regulate PFAS. However, the Canadian Ministries of Environment and Health has just dropped the fluoropolymers from a draft proposal that would otherwise regulate PFAS as a class. And that is the result of lots of pressure from US manufacturers and other industries as we're pushing to exclude this type of chemicals from the umbrella class, basically ban. But they are really planning to phase out certain uses, again, particularly firefighting foams, in the next couple years. However, a detailed timeline is still not clear. We're expecting by 2025, sometimes in 2025, as Canada implements regulations in a step with global conventions like the Stockholm Convention on POPs. South America, in particular Brazil, is at an earlier stage of development for regulations, and no firm deadlines for a broad restriction has been established yet. However, the national policies are gradually moving towards adopting international standards with a focus on addressing contaminants in the water supplies. So as you saw, regulations vary, not only in the US, which they vary state by state. Some follow the EPA standards, some don't. Different countries across the world also have different regulations concerning PFAS. And the regulations also change over time. One really needs to monitor, track, and compare the regulations in each region of their operations to minimize the penalties and costly violations. By staying ahead of this rapidly evolving regulatory landscape across the US, but also globally. So is there a tool that can help you to monitor and track and basically stay ahead of this game? Yes, there are a few tools out there to help you to navigate the PFAS regulations. So Global PFAS Regulatory Dashboard is one of the tools out there that can help you navigate the ever-changing regulations for PFAS. As you can see, there are 4 major panels here. On the top left, there's a map that can obviously help you to identify your target location. On the bottom left, there are 2 panels. You can select the pending regulations or regulation in place. And on the bottom panel, you can see the target media for the regulations: agriculture, air, biosolids. You're going to scroll down to groundwater. And on the right side, that's where all the regulations that are available after you select your criteria are shown. Now I'm gonna see if I can play this video here. Yeah, so as I said, you can select the regulations, whether or not they're pending. The classifications is shown here. You can select your target, and you can basically select any location in the world that has a PFAS regulation. So now I'm going to select France. Regulations are shown here. You can click on the link here. That will take you to the reference that was used for this specific regulations. We're going to US. You can select any of the states. Wyoming, California. These are regulations are shown here. AFFF, consumer products, drinking water regulations, PFAS limit, PFAS, all the MCLs, legal manufacturing, packaging. You can scroll through and select your desired regulations. You can select the groundwater regulations, hazardous substance, food packaging, anything that's really out there in the compliance world of PFAS. Now that you know there are tools that can help you to stay ahead of the game, you know there are tools out there to help you navigate and track the PFAS regulations. You also want to know whether or not this PFAS is yours. So now I'm going to hand it to Jason, who is going to go over PFAS forensic tools. Jason?
Thank you, Nassim. With PFAS being found throughout the natural and the built environment, it's important to know whose PFAS are you really looking at, and given the cost of potentially the assessment and remediation, it's a really important question. So as I mentioned, with with the big question of whose PFAS is it, there's different forensic approaches for identifying potential sources. Whether those sources are AFFF, non-AFFF, or potentially mixed sources. And those really start with the upfront, the PFAS analysis piece, and that can either be quantitative or semi-quantitative. And then there's, I guess, several different approaches, starting with probably the simplest is just data visualization approaches, using things like radar plots, which are that middle figure there, or other graphical approaches to looking at and presenting the data. You can get more advanced and use what's called applied statistics and do things like principal component analysis or cluster analysis. But what I really want to focus on in today's call is the advancement of data science, and really AI, and more specifically machine learning and predictive modeling in terms of potentially identifying sources. The challenge with source identification based on composition is really complicated by the fate and transport of the compounds in the environment, through differential mobility and transformation, particularly the precursor compounds into more of the analytes that we actually measure analytically. So composition can vary significantly even at non-complex sites. Ways of overcoming, the compositional challenges that fate and transport presents is applying an assumption that really compositions can vary, and as I mentioned, even for non-complex sites, they can vary significantly. But the environmental behaviors that produced those compositions are really the same everywhere, and machine learning classifier that's trained to recognize the compositions will recognize that pattern wherever it exists. What is machine learning? Well, there are algorithms used which really applies statistics to finding patterns in large amounts of data sets. So the distinction here is there's training data sets, which are data that's been collected that has all the different features defined within the data set. So in the example here that's on the slide, you have a basket of fruit, and some of the defining features for, say, an apple, it's round, it's red, could be green, banana, yellow. So the training data sets are given those features. And then when you run test data through the algorithms, it really classifies and looks for the patterns based on those features, and then provides a probabilistic classification as to whether the fruit in question here is an apple or a banana. So it's really about finding patterns in large amounts of data. I mentioned the training data sets. It's really important that you have a variety of data sources included within that training data set. High certainty AFFF sources, for instance, and that's really from the aviation, both military and non-military sources. High certainty non-AFFF sources, places like coatings, metal plating, tanneries. And then what we would classify as mixed data sources, which can be a landfill, wastewater treatment plants, or in the oil and gas industry, refineries, other industrial sources, even recreational skiing. And by building those large data sets, when you put in the test data, it does basically find the patterns that exist for each of these potential sources, and then classifies with using statistics. And the algorithms do a great job of identifying potential sources and identifying outliers. So machine learning is a capable approach to identifying sources, and it's a complicated topic and more than we can discuss today, but really just wanted to identify it that the forensic approaches to identifying, whose PFAS is really evolving, and there are sources or digital solutions now that do a great job of it.
So as we wrap up today, here are 3 takeaways for you. With all the recent PFAS developments, now is the time to evaluate your PFAS risk. Don't wait. Second one, a growing regulatory trend for PFAS is to ban PFAS as a class rather than as individual compounds like PFOA, PFOS, or other PFAS constituents. And then finally, machine learning is a viable method for PFAS source identification in environmental samples, something we'll hear more and more about. Thank you, Nasim and Jason, for sharing your expertise and insights on this topic. At this time, we're ready to address questions from our audience. Remember, you can still submit your questions via the Q&A tool up until the close of our broadcast today. Okay, everyone. We appreciate you hanging in there for this short webinar. And we do have a few questions that have come in. Remember, you can pose your questions right up until we're done today, and we will get back to you with responses to those questions. But the first question that's come in is for Jason. And Jason, the question is, in the forensics presentation, you make the distinction between training data sets and actual test data. Can you elaborate more on how big the training data sets need to be for the sample classification to be fairly accurate?
Great question, Jack. And the answer is large. The commercial applications that I'm aware of, the number of samples that are in those training data sets is measured in the thousands, and in some cases, close to 15,000. The more data that's in those training data sets, the more accurate statistical classification will be. So we are really talking about large data sets from known sources. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks. I'll take the next question that's here. I can scroll down. So the question is, when reaching out to suppliers regarding PFAS in their products, is it best to send a written request and request one in reply? It's great to have a conversation with your suppliers, but certainly for that documentation purposes and for potential follow-up, I think it's important to actually send a written request and request a written response. That might be an online tool that you use. It might be an actual letter that emails back and forth, but I think definitely have a written type of request or some sort of document that you can go back to is really critical. So let's see what other questions have come in here. Jason, I'm going to toss this one to you. And
okay.
I think if none other ones come in, then we'll wrap after this one. What do U.S.-based companies need to do if PFAS is found in their water supply and it's not due to any of their own production workflows?
Ooh, interesting one. I'll go back to, I guess, initially your first action item, which is really do that PFAS desktop audit. Make sure the data that you have is actually accurate. Might be worth a discussion with the water supplier. If you're producing your own well, again, probably, or producing your own water on an on-site well, I guess evaluate the potential risks to the workers, et cetera, and then potentially take proactive steps to minimize those exposures. And then potentially engage with, if it's an external water supplier, with them to remove it, and or potentially a regulator to identify the source.
I think just to add on to that too, there are certainly lots of databases out there too that can be looked at what's going on in the neighborhood, so to speak, so you can gather more information from that standpoint. So Well, we promised we would keep this short for you today. There are some other questions I see that are just popping in. We will respond to you directly with those questions. But once again, thank you to Nasim and Jason for sharing your time and expertise today. All of you out there, don't forget, you can download a copy of today's slides and additional materials from the resource list on your screen. And again, remember, today's webinar will be available in 2 hours, and you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording. When you exit, there will be a survey, and we'd greatly appreciate if you could fill that out. That helps us fine-tune our webinars for future use, provides us valuable feedback. And don't forget to register for our next webinar, which will be taking place in 2 weeks on November 14 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It's called From Compliance Risk to Solutions, EHS Best Practices for Warehouse Operations. You can find more information on that webinar in the resource list on your screen. So, folks, this has been a quick one, but we hope the information's been valuable to you and that everyone stay healthy and stay safe. And have a wonderful day, and we'll look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Have a great day now.